The old truck groaned up the final incline, its engine a ragged cough against the sharp, thin air of the high Rockies. Elias Thorne kept his hands locked on the wheel, knuckles white. His gaze was fixed forward, through the bug-splattered windshield, toward the end of the dirt track and the beginning of his self-imposed exile. Beside him, a German shepherd sat ramrod straight, its intelligent eyes scanning the dense pine forest with an intensity that mirrored his own. The dog's name was Kaiser. He was more than a pet. He was an anchor. He was the only piece of the old world Elias had allowed himself to keep. The truck shuddered to a halt in a small, grassy clearing. Before them, the mountain rose like a granite wall, a sheer face of stone and stubborn, clinging trees. Elias killed the engine. The sudden stillness was immense, a physical weight that pressed in on the cab. It was a silence he had been chasing for 3 years, a silence he hoped might one day drown out the other sounds, the ones that lived in his head. "We're here, boy," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Kaiser whined softly, a low thrum in his chest, and nudged his cold, wet nose against Elias's hand. The touch was a grounding wire. It pulled him back from the edge of a memory, from the feel of a different, more hostile cold. Elias took a deep, steadying breath of the pine-scented air. This was it. The place was a small parcel of land he had bought online, sight unseen. 10 acres of vertical wilderness, notable only for the deep, natural cave system that honeycombed the base of the rock face. The listing had called it a unique geological feature. Elias called it a fortress. He got out of the truck, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The air was cold, even in late summer, carrying a promise of the brutal winter to come. He welcomed it. The cold kept him sharp. Kaiser leaped from the passenger seat, landing with a soft thud. He immediately began a perimeter sweep, his nose to the ground, tail held low and purposeful. A soldier on patrol. Elias watched him for a moment, a flicker of something like a smile touching his lips. The dog understood the mission. The mission was survival. The mission was stillness. Over the next few weeks, the small town of Silver Creek, nestled in the valley 5 miles below, became aware of the strange newcomer on the mountain. At first, it was just the sound, a distant, metallic clang that echoed down the valley on clear days. Then came the sightings. Elias's old truck, laden with rebar, bags of concrete, and heavy steel plates, rumbling through the town's single main street. He never stopped for pleasantries. He would pull up to the hardware store, hand over a list written in a precise, blocky script, pay in cash, and leave. His interactions were minimal, his face a stoic mask. The townspeople watched him from behind the windows of the diner and the post office. They saw a man with shadows under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that never seemed to ease. They saw the big, serious dog that was always with him, watching everything, trusting no one. "What do you suppose he's building up there?" Sarah, the owner of the general store, asked Sheriff Brody one afternoon. She stood on a porch, wiping her hands on her apron, watching Elias's truck disappear up the mountain road. Sheriff Brody pushed his hat back on his head, his brow furrowed. "Don't know, Sarah. He bought the old Hemlock parcel, the one with the caves." A man named Garrett, leaning against a porch post, whittling a piece of wood, snorted. Garrett was a builder, a man whose family had lived in Silver Creek for 5 generations. He considered the valley his domain. "Heard he's a vet," Garrett said, not looking up from his work. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Probably building himself a bunker, one of those crazy prepper types." The laughter that followed was light, but it had a sharp, nervous edge. In a town like Silver Creek, where everyone knew everyone's business, an outsider was an anomaly. An outsider who was actively, obsessively building a fortress was a threat to the comfortable quiet. Elias was oblivious to the specifics of the gossip, but he felt the weight of their stares. He had felt them his whole life, it seemed, or at least since he had come back. He didn't care. Their judgment was a distant hum, easily ignored next to the roar of his own purpose. His work was methodical, relentless. He rose before the sun, the cold air a shock to his system that he craved. He worked until the sun fell behind the western peaks, plunging the clearing into deep shadow. The project was ambitious. He was not just building a cabin. He was transforming the largest of the caves into a self-sufficient, impregnable shelter. He cleared the entrance, widening it and reinforcing the rock walls with concrete and steel mesh. He framed out rooms within the cavern's natural contours, a small living space, a storage pantry, a workshop. The deepest, most protected part of the cave he designated for the geothermal heating system he had designed himself. It was a complex network of pipes and vents that would draw warmth from the Earth's core, a steady, reliable heat source that required no electricity, no fuel. It required only the Earth itself. Kaiser was his constant shadow. The dog would lie in a patch of sun, watching Elias work, his head on his paws, but his ears always twitching, cataloging every sound. Sometimes a falling rock or the sharp crack of a distant branch would bring him to his feet in an instant, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias would stop, listen, and scan the woods with him. "Easy, boy," he'd murmur, "just the mountain settling." But he appreciated the vigilance. He understood it. The world was a place where things settled, and where things fell. You had to be ready. The whispers in town grew louder as summer bled into autumn. The leaves on the aspens turned a brilliant, fiery yellow. The air grew colder, the scent of snow never far off. Elias's project was taking visible shape. The entrance to the cave was now framed by a thick, reinforced concrete facade. Set into it was a heavy steel door, the kind used for industrial freezers, and a single, small window made of triple-paned, shatterproof glass. It looked less like a home and more like an entrance to a vault. "Calls it his cabin," Garrett scoffed to his friends at the town's only bar. "More like Fort Knox. What's he so afraid of?" The question echoed the community's general sentiment. They were a hardy, self-reliant people, accustomed to harsh winters and isolation. But Elias's preparations seemed to go beyond prudence. They felt like paranoia. They felt like an indictment of their own way of life, as if he knew something they did not. One crisp October afternoon, Sheriff Brody decided it was time for an official visit. He drove his cruiser up the winding dirt road, the suspension groaning in protest. He found Elias hauling a massive iron wood stove from the bed of his truck on a heavy-duty dolly. Sweat beaded on Elias's forehead despite the cold, his jaw set with effort. Kaiser stood near the cave entrance, hackles slightly raised, a low, warning growl emanating from his chest. "Thorne," Brody called out, keeping a respectful distance from the dog. Elias stopped, letting the dolly rest. He wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand, his expression unreadable. "Sheriff?" Brody gestured vaguely at the concrete and steel structure. "Making some progress up here." Elias nodded, saying nothing. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. "Look, son," Brody said, his tone softening slightly. "People are talking. They're a little on edge about all this." He tried to sound casual, neighborly. "Just wondering what your intentions are." Elias's gaze was direct, and for a moment Brody felt like the one being scrutinized. "Building a home," Elias said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Just want to be left alone." Brody sighed. He was a good man, caught between his duty and the anxieties of his town. "I understand that. But the materials you're bringing up here, the scale of it all, it's unusual. You have to admit that." Elias looked past Brody, his eyes on the distant peaks, already dusted with the first snows. "It's what's necessary," he said, more to himself than to the sheriff. The conversation went nowhere else. Brody left with no more information than he'd arrived with, and a deeper sense of unease. The man wasn't hostile, he was just gone, as if the most important part of him was somewhere else entirely. That night, the first hard frost settled over the valley. The cold seeped into the small temporary trailer Elias had been living in while he worked. He lay on his cot, wrapped in a thin sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl. The sound was a key, unlocking a door in his mind he tried to keep bolted shut. The cold, the sharp, biting wind. Suddenly, he was not in the Colorado Rockies. He was in the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan. The air was thin, burning his lungs. The snow was coming down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet of white. A freak storm, unforecasted, unforgiving. "We have to move," a voice shouted, barely audible over the roar of the wind. "Visibility is 0. We'll lose the path," another voice screamed back. Elias could feel the heavy weight of his pack, the biting cold of the rifle in his hands. He could feel the panic coiling in his gut, a cold snake. They were exposed, high on a ridge, miles from any shelter. The cold was a physical enemy, stealing their strength, their warmth, their will. He remembered the stillness that came after the shouting stopped, the heavy, suffocating silence of a world buried in white. He remembered digging for hours, his fingers raw and bleeding, searching for his team, finding them, still, so terribly still. He was back in his trailer, gasping for air. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sleeping bag was a shroud, suffocating him. He thrashed, kicking it away, his breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. The cold metal of the trailer wall pressed against his back, as cold as the snow. A heavy weight settled on his chest. A wet nose pressed insistently against his cheek. A low, deep whine cut through the noise in his head. Kaiser. The dog had climbed onto the cot and was now lying across him, a living, breathing blanket of warmth and pressure. Elias's hands came up, clutching the thick fur on the dog's neck. He buried his face in Kaiser's side, his body shaking uncontrollably. Kaiser didn't move. He just lay there, a solid, unwavering presence. He licked the tears and sweat from Elias's face, his rough tongue an anchor to the present, to this trailer, to this mountain, to now. Slowly, the hammering in Elias's chest began to subside. His breathing evened out. The ghosts of the Hindu Kush receded, banished by the warmth and weight of the dog. "Good boy," Elias whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "Good boy, Kaiser." He lay there for a long time, holding on to his dog, the only thing that could consistently pull him back from the brink. The incident hardened his resolve. The work became even more frantic. He was racing against the coming winter. He was racing against his own memories. He finished the geothermal system, a triumph of engineering that left him exhausted but satisfied. He installed the wood stove, its heavy iron body a promise of defiant warmth. He built shells and stocked them with military precision. Canned goods, dried beans, rice, medical supplies, batteries, water purification tablets. Enough for one man and one dog to survive for 6 months. By mid-November, the cave cabin was complete. He moved out of the cold, flimsy trailer and into the deep, quiet warmth of the mountain. The heavy steel door closed with a satisfying, final thud, shutting out the world. Inside it was silent. Not the dead, empty silence of the snow-covered ridge in his memory, but a living stillness. The low hum of the geothermal vents, the soft crackle of the fire in the wood stove, the gentle snores of Kaiser curled up on a thick rug by the hearth. For the first time in years, Elias felt a measure of peace. He was safe. He was prepared. Nothing could touch him here. The first snows of the season arrived, blanketing the valley in a pristine layer of white. The people of Silver Creek settled in for the winter as they always did. They chopped wood, insulated their windows, and made sure their pantries were full. They felt prepared. They looked up at the strange concrete scar on the mountainside and shook their heads. "Crazy vet," Garrett would say, a new, almost fond derision in his voice. He had become a local boogeyman, a cautionary tale, the man who was so afraid of the world he had buried himself alive. But Elias, in his fortress, noticed things the townspeople did not. His training had honed his senses, made him a student of patterns and anomalies. He noticed the silence of the forest first. The birds had vanished. The squirrels, usually frantic in their late autumn gathering, were nowhere to be seen. Even the deer, which often came to the edge of his clearing, had disappeared into the deep woods. The forest was holding its breath. Kaiser felt it too, The dog was restless, pacing the length of the small cabin, his ears pinned back. He would stand at the triple-paned window, staring out at the sky, a low, anxious whine in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked, placing a hand on the dog's back. The fur there was tense, rigid. Elias looked at the sky. It was a strange color, a bruised, heavy gray-green he had never seen before. The clouds were not moving in from the west as they usually did. They seemed to be descending from directly above, a ceiling of churning, malevolent vapor. He checked the weather report on his small, hand-cranked radio. The forecast was for a significant snowstorm. 3 to 4 feet, the announcer said cheerfully. A good start to the ski season. Elias switched off the radio. He trusted the silence of the forest more than the voice on the airwaves. His gut, a finely tuned instrument of survival, was screaming at him. This was not a normal storm. This was something else. This was the kind of thing you did not survive by being merely prepared. He thought of the town below, the old, drafty houses, the reliance on a power grid that went out in a stiff breeze, the casual confidence of people who had never faced a true enemy. For a moment, he hesitated. It was not his problem. He had come here to be alone. He had built this place to save himself, not them. Their mockery echoed in his mind. Crazy vet. He looked at Kaiser, who was still staring out the window, whining. The dog was worried, not for himself, for them. Elias's jaw clenched. He owed them nothing, but he remembered the stillness of the snow. He remembered the faces of his men, serene and frozen under a blanket of white. He had been the only one to survive, a fluke, a curse. He could not just sit here and listen to the silence again. He picked up the satellite phone, a piece of emergency equipment he had never expected to use. He dialed the number for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody answered, his voice weary. "Brody, it's Thorne," Elias said, his voice clipped. "The storm that's coming, it's not what they're saying. It's worse. Much worse." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Brody sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Thorne, we've got the forecast. It's a big one, sure. We're telling folks to hunker down. We'll be fine. We always are." "You don't understand," Elias insisted, his voice rising with an urgency he could not suppress. "The pressure is dropping too fast. The animals are gone. This is a complete weather system collapse. You need to evacuate the low-lying areas. You need to get people to the community hall. It's the only building with a generator." "Evacuate?" Brody's voice was now laced with disbelief and irritation. "Based on what? Your gut feeling? The squirrels taking a day off? I've got a whole town to manage, son. I don't have time for conspiracy theories." The line went quiet. Elias could hear the unspoken words. Crazy vet. "Just a warning, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice flat again. He had done his duty. He had offered the intelligence. It had been dismissed. The story of his life. "Noted," Brody said curtly, and hung up. Elias slowly lowered the phone. A heavy sense of resignation settled over him. He had tried. He turned from the window and double-checked the seals on his door. He threw another log into the wood stove. He filled the bowl with food for Kaiser and one for himself. Then he sat in his worn armchair, the dog's head resting on his knee, and waited. An hour later, it began. There was no gentle prelude of flakes. The sky simply opened up. A solid wall of wind and snow slammed into the mountain with the force of a physical blow. The sound was a deafening, high-pitched scream. It was the sound he remembered from the ridge. Elias's breath caught in his chest. Kaiser whined, pressing closer to him. Elias stroked the dog's head, his own heart pounding. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, though the words were for himself. "We're safe this time. We're inside." Outside, the world vanished. The triple-paned window, which looked out over the valley, was instantly plastered with a thick, impenetrable layer of white. The light in the cabin dimmed, as if the sun had been extinguished. The temperature inside the cave cabin remained a steady, comfortable 70 degrees. The geothermal vents hummed their quiet, constant song. The fire crackled. Kaiser, reassured by the warmth and the stillness within their fortress, eventually settled back onto his rug and fell asleep. Elias did not sleep. He sat in his chair, listening to the storm trying to tear the mountain apart. He thought of the town below. He imagined the wind tearing at the old roofs. He imagined the snow piling up, heavy and wet, against flimsy wooden doors. He imagined the power lines snapping, plunging the valley into cold and darkness. He felt a grim, hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach. It was not satisfaction. It was not vindication. It was grief. The storm raged for 2 days without pause. The world beyond his steel door ceased to exist. It was just the howling of the wind and the deep, warm silence of the cave. On the morning of the 3rd day, the satellite phone rang. The sound was jarring, an intrusion from a world he had shut out. He let it ring 3 times before he answered. "Thorn?" The voice on the other end was faint, broken by static. "Thorn, it's Brody. Can you hear me?" "I hear you, Sheriff." "God, I can't believe this thing still works," Brody's voice crackled. He sounded exhausted, defeated. "You were right. You were right about all of it." Elias said nothing. "It's bad, Thorn. It's apocalyptic. Snow's up to the 2nd story on some houses. The power went out the first hour. No heat. Roofs are starting to collapse from the weight." The sheriff's voice broke. "We've got people trapped. We can't get to them. The plows are useless. We need help." A direct plea, the one thing Elias had not prepared for. He had built this place to hide from the world, not to save it. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Garrett's family," Brody said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "His wife, his 2 kids, they're on the north side of town. His roof gave way. He was out trying to help a neighbor, and now he can't get back. The house is buried. We can hear them on the radio, but they're freezing, Thorn. The little one has asthma." Garrett, the skeptic, the one who had led the chorus of mockery. A sharp, bitter irony twisted in Elias's gut. He looked at the crackling fire, at the sleeping dog, at the deep, secure peace of his shelter. He could say no. He could say the storm was too bad. He could say it was impossible. He could go back to being alone. He thought of a young boy with asthma, gasping in the cold and the dark. He thought of his men, their breath frosting the air, and then nothing. The guilt of the survivor was a heavy cloak. Maybe this was a chance to finally take it off. "What's the address?" Elias asked. A half-hour later, he was ready. He was dressed in military-grade winter gear, a thermal suit that sealed in his body heat. He had a pack filled with emergency supplies, thermal blankets, medical kits, high-energy food bars, a small shovel. On his feet, he wore a pair of modern, lightweight snowshoes. He turned to Kaiser, who was watching him, every muscle tensed. "You're up, boy," Elias said, attaching a small but powerful LED light to the dog's harness. "I need you to find the way." Kaiser whined, understanding. He was born for this. His thick double coat was a natural defense against the cold. His powerful senses could navigate a world without landmarks. Elias took a deep breath, his hand on the lever for the heavy steel door. Opening it felt like a betrayal of everything he had built. It felt like stepping back into the nightmare. He pulled the lever. The door swung inward, and the storm flooded in. It was not a door to the outside world. It was a door to a solid wall of white. The snow was packed right up against the entrance, higher than the door itself. He had not just been snowed in, he had been buried. For a moment, a cold, sharp panic seized him. Trapped. But then his training kicked in. Assess, adapt, overcome. He grabbed his shovel. For the next hour, he dug. He carved a narrow tunnel upward through the densely packed snow. It was like digging a grave in reverse. Kaiser stayed behind him, a silent, patient presence in the warm cabin. Finally, his shovel broke through into open air. He widened the hole and pulled himself up and out. The world that met him was alien and terrifying. The wind was a physical force, a solid wall that threatened to knock him off his feet. The snow was not falling anymore. It was a swirling, horizontal blizzard, a blinding vortex of ice particles that stung his exposed skin. Visibility was less than 5 feet. The landscape he knew was gone. The trees were white ghosts, laden with impossible amounts of snow. The clearing was a rolling, featureless desert of white. He was standing on at least 10 feet of snow. He called for Kaiser. The dog scrambled up the tunnel and emerged, shaking the snow from his coat. He immediately dropped his nose, tasting the air, his powerful senses cutting through the whiteout. "Find them, Kaiser," Elias shouted over the wind, his voice snatched away instantly. "Find Garrett's house. Find the people." Kaiser looked at him, then turned and plunged into the swirling chaos. Elias followed, a ghost chasing a shadow in a world of white. The journey down the mountain was a brutal, disorienting ordeal. There was no path, there were no landmarks. There was only the storm and the dark shape of the dog moving ahead of him. Kaiser was his compass, his guide. The dog moved with an unerring sense of direction, navigating by scent and some deep, primal instinct. He led them around massive snowdrifts that were as large as houses and through groves of trees that had become treacherous, snow-laden tunnels. Elias focused on one thing only, putting one snowshoe in front of the other. He did not allow himself to think about the cold. He did not allow himself to think about the past. He was a machine, moving through the storm. After what felt like an eternity, Kaiser stopped. He barked, a sharp, urgent sound that barely carried over the wind. They had reached the edge of town, or what was left of it. It was unrecognizable. The houses were shapeless, white mounds. The streets were gone. Only the tops of the tallest roofs and chimneys were visible, like tombstones in a white graveyard. The silence here was different. It was the heavy, muffled silence of a town being suffocated. Kaiser barked again, pawing at a huge drift that Elias realized was, or had been, a 2-story house. A single, second-floor window was partially visible, shattered. This was it.
"Hello!" Elias shouted, his voice raw. "Is anyone in there?"
A faint, weak cry came from within. "Help! Please, help us!" Elias didn't hesitate. He set to work with his shovel, digging frantically at the snow blocking the window. The snow was heavy, compacted by the wind. Every shovelful was a monumental effort. Kaiser dug alongside him, using his paws with a desperate energy, throwing plumes of snow behind him. Finally, they cleared an opening. Elias shone his headlamp into the dark, frigid room. The scene inside was dire. A woman, Garrett's wife, was huddled in a corner with 2 small children wrapped in a single, thin blanket. They were pale, their lips blue. The little boy was wheezing, his breath a shallow, rattling gasp. A large section of the roof had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole to the screaming storm above. "I'm here to get you out," Elias said, his voice calm and authoritative. The woman looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She recognized him, the crazy vet from the mountain. Elias climbed through the window. The cold in the room was savage, far worse than the cold outside. He worked quickly, his movements efficient and practiced. He wrapped the mother and the 2 children in the high-tech thermal blankets from his pack. They were thin and metallic, but they immediately began to reflect their body heat back at them. He pulled a small, sealed auto-injector from his medical kit. "Is this your son?" he asked, pointing to the boy. The woman nodded, shivering too hard to speak. "He has asthma. This is an emergency dose of epinephrine. It will open his airways. Is that okay?" She nodded again, her eyes pleading. Elias administered the shot with a practiced hand. Almost immediately, the boy's wheezing began to ease. His breaths became deeper, less ragged. "We have to go, now," Elias said. He bundled the smaller child, a little girl, and strapped her to his chest. "Can you carry your son?" he asked the mother. She nodded, her strength seeming to return with the flicker of hope. "The way out is dangerous. You have to follow me exactly. Do you understand?" She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not fear, but a flicker of grim determination. "Yes," she whispered. Getting them out of the house and back into the storm was the most difficult thing Elias had ever done. He led the way, with Kaiser scouting just ahead. The woman followed, clutching her son, her face a mask of sheer will. The wind was a relentless predator, trying to tear them apart, to steal their warmth and their resolve. Elias was their shield. He positioned his body to block the worst of the wind, creating a small pocket of relative calm for the woman and her children. He guided them through the treacherous, alien landscape of their own buried town. They passed other houses, other white mounds. Faint cries for help seemed to come from all around them, ghosts on the wind. He had to ignore them. His mission was to save this family, one mission at a time. That was the only way to survive. They were halfway to the community hall, a journey of a few hundred yards that had become a life-or-death expedition when it happened. They were moving along the side of what had been the main street, a narrow canyon between massive snowdrifts. Suddenly, a deep, groaning sound came from above. Elias looked up. The roof of the hardware store, overloaded with tons of snow and ice, was giving way. "Move!" he screamed. He shoved the woman forward, pushing her and her son out of the immediate danger zone. But he was not fast enough himself. A huge section of the roof, a tangled mass of timber, shingles, and heavy, compacted snow, collapsed into the street right in front of him. He threw himself backward, the little girl on his chest letting out a terrified wail. He landed hard in a snowdrift. He was safe. But Kaiser, who had been just ahead of him, was not. A heavy wooden beam, part of the falling roof, had struck the dog, sending him tumbling into the snow. Kaiser let out a sharp, piercing cry of pain. "Kaiser!" Elias yelled, scrambling to his feet. He found the dog half buried in the debris, struggling to stand. His back leg was bent at an unnatural angle. The bone was clearly broken. Kaiser whined, a low, pathetic sound, and tried to lick Elias's hand. The sight broke something inside Elias. His dog, this loyal, fearless creature who had pulled him from his nightmares, who had guided him through the storm, who had never once hesitated. All the control, all the discipline, all the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled in that moment. He knelt in the snow, his hands hovering over the injured leg, a raw, animal sound of anguish tearing from his own throat. The mission was forgotten. The town was forgotten. The cold was forgotten. There was only Kaiser. He gently, carefully, lifted the 100-pound dog into his arms. Kaiser whimpered but licked his face, his tail giving a weak, pained thump against Elias's chest. Elias stood up, the dog a heavy, precious weight. The little girl on his chest was crying. Garrett's wife was staring at him, her face a mixture of horror and awe. The community hall, the goal, was still 100 yards away. His own shelter, his fortress of safety, was miles back up the mountain. He made his choice in a heartbeat. It was not a choice at all. He looked at the woman. "The hall is straight ahead," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not recognize. "Don't stop. Don't look back. Go." She hesitated, her eyes on the injured dog in his arms. "Go!" he roared, a command forged in the fires of a battlefield. She went. She scrambled forward, clutching her son, and disappeared into the swirling snow. Elias turned and began the long, impossible journey back up the mountain. He carried his dog. He left his pack with its precious supplies behind. He left the path to safety. He was no longer a rescuer. He was just a man trying to save his best friend. The journey back was a delirium of pain and exhaustion. The weight of the dog was immense. Every step was a struggle. The wind clawed at him, trying to drag him down into the snow. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed. He fell multiple times, shielding Kaiser with his own body, taking the impact, then struggling back to his feet. He talked to the dog, his words snatched away by the wind, but he said them anyway. "Hang on, boy. We're almost there. Just hang on. I've got you." He was not just talking to the dog. He was talking to himself. He was talking to the ghosts on the ridge, making a promise he had been unable to keep to them. I'm not leaving you behind. Not this time. He did not know how he made it back to the tunnel entrance. He moved on pure, raw instinct, his body screaming for him to stop, to lie down, to let the cold take it. But the warm, whimpering weight in his arms would not let him. He stumbled into the tunnel and half fell, half slid down into the warmth and stillness of the cave. The heavy steel door, which he had propped open with a wedge, swung shut behind him, its final thud sealing them in. He lay on the floor for a long moment, gasping for air, Kaiser still cradled in his arms. They were safe. He had gotten him home. He carefully carried Kaiser to the rug by the fire and gently laid him down. He worked quickly, his hands shaking, but his mind clear. He cut away the fur around the wound. It was a bad break, a compound fracture. He cleaned the wound, administered a powerful canine painkiller and an antibiotic from his extensive medical kit. Then, using 2 small, straight pieces of wood from his kindling pile and a roll of medical tape, he fashioned a crude but effective splint, immobilizing the leg. Kaiser watched him the whole time, his brown eyes filled with a deep, unwavering trust. He licked Elias's hand when he was done, a gesture of gratitude that was almost too much to bear. Elias collapsed into his armchair, every muscle in his body protesting. The little girl's cries still echoed in his ears. He had strapped her to his chest, a tiny, terrified life. He had forgotten. In his single-minded focus on saving Kaiser, he had forgotten the child. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so powerful it made him dizzy. He had abandoned her. He had abandoned them all, just like before. He buried his face in his hands, his body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. He had failed. Again. He did not know how long he sat there, lost in his own personal hell. But eventually, a soft touch on his arm pulled him back. He looked up. It was Kaiser. The dog had dragged himself across the floor on 3 legs, his splinted leg held carefully off the ground. He rested his heavy head on Elias's knee, his eyes soft with concern. He nudged Elias's hand as if to say, "It's okay. You're okay. We're okay." Elias looked at the dog, then at the small, empty space on his own chest where the little girl had been. A new, horrifying thought struck him. Had he unstrapped her? Had he handed her to her mother? He couldn't remember. The journey back was a blur of white and pain. The possibility that he had carried her all the way back up the mountain only to leave her outside in the storm was a fresh and terrible torment. He lurched to his feet and stumbled to the door, his heart pounding with a new dread. He threw the heavy door open. A blast of cold air and snow filled the entrance. He stared out into the swirling white, his headlamp cutting a useless, narrow beam. "Hello?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" Only the howl of the wind answered him. The storm raged for another 2 days. Elias did not sleep. He sat by the window, staring into the white void, a prisoner of his own guilt. He tended to Kaiser, changing his dressing, giving him water, speaking to him in low, comforting tones. But his mind was in the town below, with the family he had tried and failed to save. On the 5th day, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was as shocking as the noise had been. Elias opened the door. The world was transformed. An endless, rolling landscape of pristine white snow lay under a sky of impossible, brilliant blue. The sun on the snow was blinding. The valley was buried. He could see the tops of a few buildings, the community hall among them. A thin plume of smoke rose from its chimney, a sign of life. He did not know whether to feel relief or despair. A few hours later, he heard a sound, a rhythmic crunching. He looked out from his doorway and saw a group of figures moving slowly up the mountain toward him. They were wearing snowshoes, struggling through the deep powder. At the front of the group were 2 men, Sheriff Brody and Garrett. Elias's jaw tightened. He stood in the entrance of his fortress, a silent, solitary figure, and waited. Kaiser, sensing his tension, limped to his side, a low growl in his chest. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, placing a hand on the dog's head. The group stopped a few yards away. Their faces were gaunt, etched with exhaustion and hardship. Garrett's face was raw, chapped by the wind, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked at Elias, and his expression was one of profound, humbling shame. He took a step forward, his gaze falling on Kaiser's splinted leg. "My God," Garrett whispered. He looked back at Elias, and his eyes filled with tears. "My wife, my kids. They told me what you did." Garrett's voice was thick, choked with emotion. "You saved them. You walked into hell, and you carried them out." He gestured to the dog. "And your dog, he was hurt protecting you, protecting us." Elias remained silent, his face a stony mask, but his heart was pounding. Garrett took another step forward, his hand outstretched. He stopped, letting it fall to his side, as if realizing the gesture was inadequate. I'm so sorry," he said, the words a painful, raw confession. "The things we said, the way we treated you, we were fools. We were arrogant and blind." Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his face grim. "He's right, Thorne. We owe you everything. You tried to warn us. We didn't listen." Brody looked around at the silent, white world. We have losses, people we couldn't get to. But it would have been so much worse. My radio is picking up reports from other towns. They're gone, wiped out. Silver Creek is still here because of you." Elias's throat was tight. He could not speak. A small figure pushed through the group of men. It was Sarah from the general store. In her hands, she held a steaming thermos and a cloth-wrapped bundle. She approached him cautiously, her eyes soft with a sorrow and gratitude that was almost unbearable. "We brought you some soup," she said quietly, "and a blanket for your hero." She knelt down, ignoring Elias completely, and gently draped a thick wool blanket over Kaiser's back. The dog, instead of growling, leaned into her touch and licked her hand. A small child, Garrett's daughter, peeked out from behind her father's legs. She pointed a mitten-clad hand at Elias. "The mountain man," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "He carried me. I was on his chest." Elias's breath hitched. He stared at the little girl, a storm of relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He hadn't left her. He had gotten her to her mother. He just didn't remember. The blank spot in his memory filled in, not with a picture, but with a feeling. The feeling of unstrapping the child and placing her in her mother's arms just before he turned back for Kaiser. Garrett stepped forward again. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do all this? Why did you build this place?" The question hung in the cold, still air. It was the question the whole town had been asking for months. Elias looked past them, his gaze on the distant, snow-covered peaks that reminded him so much of another place, another time. And for the first time, he spoke. He told them about Afghanistan. He told them about the ridge, the freak storm, the biting cold. He told them about being unprepared, about being the only survivor. His voice was flat, detached, as if he were reading an after-action report. But the pain was there, in the spaces between the words. "I wasn't trying to keep the world out," he finished, his voice growing quiet. "I was trying to build a place where the storm couldn't get in." He looked down at Kaiser, who was now resting his head on his splinted leg, his eyes closed. "I swore I would never be caught unprepared again. I swore I would never have to leave anyone behind in the cold again." A profound silence fell over the small group. They finally understood. It was not paranoia that had driven him. It was penance. Garrett took a deep, shuddering breath. He stepped forward, and this time he did not hesitate. He put his hand on Elias's shoulder, a simple gesture of contact, of acceptance, of community. "You're home," Garrett said, his voice thick. "It saved my family. Let us help you save our town." In the weeks that followed, the cave cabin on the mountain ceased to be a fortress of isolation. It became a command center. Elias, the strange outsider, became their leader. He used his knowledge of survival and logistics to organize the town's recovery. He taught them how to build snow shelters, how to ration food, how to navigate the buried landscape safely. Garrett, the builder, became his right-hand man. He looked at Elias's designs, at the geothermal system, at the reinforced structures, with the eye of a humbled professional. "This is genius," he would mutter, shaking his head in disbelief. "Pure genius." The people of Silver Creek, a community that had once mocked him, now followed his instructions without question. They worked together, digging out their homes, sharing resources, checking on their neighbors. The blizzard had brought them to the brink of destruction, but it had also forged them into something stronger, a true community. Elias found himself in a new and unfamiliar role. He was no longer the silent observer. He was a teacher, a protector. The heavy weight of his past had not vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer just a burden to be carried. It was a tool to be used, a lesson to be shared. One evening, as spring began to melt the edges of the colossal snowdrifts, Elias stood on the small porch he had built outside his steel door. The valley below was coming back to life. The sounds of hammers and saws echoed up the mountain, a symphony of rebuilding. Kaiser was at his side, his leg now healed, leaving him with only a slight limp. He was a hero in the town, doted on by the children, who brought him scraps of meat and showered him with affection. Elias looked out over the valley, at the town he had inadvertently saved. The shadows were still there in the corners of his mind. The cold was still a memory he could feel in his bones. But they were quieter now. They were joined by new sounds, new memories. The sound of a child's laughter, the feeling of a hand on his shoulder, the sight of a town working together, bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. He placed a hand on Kaiser's head, and the dog leaned against his leg, a familiar, grounding pressure. He was not running anymore. He was not hiding. He was home. He had faced the storm, both outside and in, and he had survived. And this time, he had not survived alone. The stillness that settled over him was not the heavy, suffocating silence of loss. It was the light, peaceful quiet of a man who had finally found his purpose. He was the mountain man, and he was finally at peace.